Okay. I'm recording it, so we're all good there. Um, all right. So first of all, it's gonna be me, Brock, and then Patrick lecturing today. Um, we also did the lecture for the November December topic if you were there for that. So um, yeah, I'm a coach from Minnetonka High School, Minnesota. I'm a first year out. But before that, I debated for about 4 years on the Minnesota circuit.
Yep. And I'm also a coach and a judge on the Texas circuit. I'm also a first year out and debated for 4 years in Texas. So we're going to get started with just generally a lesson overview. We're going to be going over key terms and a topic breakdown. We're going to go over the current events and the topic background. And then we'll go over potential affirmative cases with both traditional and progressive outlets, as well as the same for the negative. So I'm going to hand it over to Brock for the topic breakdown.
Yeah, so obviously the resolution is resolved. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. And I'm just going to break this down sort of term by term, focusing on the most important ones. First, we have the United States. For this topic, the United States means the federal government in this resolution. And I think even more than usual, you're going to see this defined this way. I don't think you'll see a lot of trickiness with the definition of the United States because it's concerning foreign policy. So this is just already the natural purview of the United States. I would really doubt that anyone tries to define the actor in any other way. Even like 50 states counterplans, I doubt they would have much solvency either, since this is again dealing with something that's really only under the purview of the federal government. But I suppose I wouldn't fully rule out that. Next, what is probably going to be the most pivotal term on this topic is substantially, because it's really, really vague. This is a term that should only belong in policy resolutions, in my opinion, but it's in this LD resolution, so we have to deal with it. Um, the problem with it is, like I said, it's vague. There's no clearly delineated, um, like bright line for what counts as substantial, and so that not only opens the doors for specification of plans, but it also means that offense and then the threshold for substantial change are inversely related. So you're gonna have to find that sweet spot if you are running a whole res affirmative of, like how much offense do I want versus am I actually like running something substantial. It also just makes these affirmatives sort of harder to justify. So this topic is going to be one where there's going to be plans abounding, um, because there's just such vagueness with that wording. Next, something that might also be a little contentious is military presence. Specifically, what actually counts as a true military presence. Um, in the West Asia North Africa region, the United States has over, and this could definitely fluctuate, 45,000 personnel in the WANA region. Um, but it's not just permanently stationed, boots on the ground uniformed personnel. This includes things like staff on bases, staff that's just there to train troops, things like that. I think a big question is going to be, does aid count? So does direct money, does that count as a military presence if the United States is giving money to certain countries to procure military arms? Um, is sending actual weapons or direct arms sales, does this count as a military presence? Um, obviously affirmatives are going to want to say that it does. So, here's this act that reduces arms sales or eliminates them entirely. Negatives are going to want to say no, it doesn't. So in general, you're going to have apps trying to be play around a little more with this wording. Negatives try to be a little more restrictive. And another thing that might trip people up at first, although I hope that debaters get pretty used to this, is the West Asia North Africa wording. This is commonly abbreviated as WANA or WANA in the topic literature. The thing about this is it's not clearly defined. There's no exact clear border of what constitutes as this. The best things you can find are lists of countries in this. Topic literature might also use some things like Southwest Asia, North Africa, Middle East, North Africa, or simply Middle East. Middle East is probably going to be like the second most common, I would say, just because that's sort of like that was the most common term for this region. Now you'll see in academia a lot more academics are trying to use the wording the resolution uses, but it's essentially referring to the same area. Um, I would advise having a definition on hand with a list of countries just in case someone does try to get a little tricky and tries to, talk about some country that is questionable as to whether or not it's actually included in that region. But in general, you should, like, I think most people have an intuitive understanding of just what a West Asia, North Africa, or especially if you're calling it Middle Eastern country is. So that should help you there, falling back on your intuitive understanding. With current affairs, this topic is pretty challenging, especially given what's going on in Gaza right now. Um, this is going to be a rapidly changing geopolitical situation. So, especially with inherency and uniqueness and things like that, you're going to need to be very up to date on those cards. Um, Also, just for general knowledge, knowing the extent of the current U.S. military presence, and this is another thing that could fluctuate a lot by the time the topic actually is in the heat of being debated. I know right now it's December, and there's maybe like one or two tournaments on this topic in December. Like the main one I can think of is the one in Minnesota, the Blake Invitational. But other than that, I don't think there's that many. But January and February, this situation could be totally different. Biden could decide to put a lot more troops in the Middle East, pull a lot of them out, especially again given the situation with Israel and Gaza. So I would also, with just getting a general understanding of the military presence, be researching this frequently and updating it frequently. Um, the majority of troops are stationed in bases in Kuwait and Bahrain, um, and most troops are, like I said, staff at bases in that region. Um, that the U.S. considers, key installations to maintain power in that region. In Syria, it's a little different. There's 900 troops stationed for counterterrorism against ISIS, so they're playing a little bit more of an active role. But in general, most troops in the region right now are not involved in combat. And then, again, the war in Gaza and its fallout is going to have significant influence on this topic, especially when it comes to the number of troops that are in the West Asia, North Africa region, and just the general situation there. For example, the U.S. recently sent an aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean to deter other states from getting involved. So that could be a potential advantage area or disadvantage area. So just be prepared for that. Be willing not only to counter people who are writing or new cases or cutting new evidence that's very dependent on the geopolitical situation, but also be prepared to run things like that if need be, if something big changes in the middle of the topic. Like I said, inherency and uniqueness cards should be upgraded pretty frequently. Old cards are going to lose you rounds, so treat everything like a politics disadvantage. You want that uniqueness or inherency card to be from, like, I guess, preferably like that day, just because things are changing so quickly. All right, now on to the affirmatives. First, it's whole resolution affirmatives. I think these are going to be challenging because the word substantially just inherently discourages these affirmatives. There's no bright line for it, so you sort of have to specify. But there are some things that you can get into with that. First is going to be American hegemony. I think it's going to be the most common whole resolution F because the U.S. having a military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region maintains that hegemony. And then it would just be, why is that bad? So power vacuums, adversary attraction, regional instability. Maybe you could go a little more abstract with it, a little more on the K side with that as well, talking about like just the harmful like idea of America as a superpower, as a global hegemon, and the harms that perpetrates. Yeah, the problem with this, again, because it's whole resolution, is that the shifting advocacy and the vague nature of that means that like pinning down what specific offense you're actually getting and how much you're actually solving for American hegemony is going to be challenging. But I think that you can sort of you can use a just sort of a gut check reasonability type argument when it comes to, is this substantial? And claim that, look, like any substantial reduction in presence in the region is likely going to result in a large change in American hegemony if our link cards are correct. There's also, you can get more specific with hegemony Fs. You can talk about how they're specifically harmful to the region or just how US presence specifically in that region is harmful. I think this is going to be where a lot of the lit is. There's a ton of lit that's just describing why the United States being in the West Asia, North Africa region is bad for the region, how it's caused instability, things like that. So things like exploitation of resources, famine, economic distress, like backlash and insurgencies against U.S. occupation. all of these things are harms to the region that exist because of U.S. military presence in the region. And I think this is probably the best whole res affirmative, just because you can prove that you're solving for most of these things. Um, and yeah. Next is economics. This one is maybe the hardest to prove, in my opinion, just because like we all have heard like the idea of wasteful wars and how they're draining a lot of money. The problem with this is it's sort of hard to know what this money would actually go towards just once we're not wasting it anymore. So getting an actual offensive argument off of this versus just purely like, oh, we're saving money. Might be a little difficult, but the general idea is that the U.S. military is expensive and wasteful, specifically when it comes to extending its influence in other countries. So then doing the affirmative would save money, benefit the economy by allowing the U.S. government to invest in civilian infrastructure, or the government can reduce deficit spending. But again, the hard part is ensuring that this money actually goes to whatever you're trying to get offense off of. So I think this is maybe the weakest whole res affirmative. Second to running a whole res affirmative that has specific advantage areas. I guess maybe, you know, very traditional tournaments, traditional circuits where specification and like plan advocacies are frowned upon. But even then, I don't see this being too common. But you're essentially running the whole resolution here, except your advantages or contentions are just tailored towards like specific countries or specific things like that. My recommendation is don't do this. Either run one of the earlier hegemony or economics arguments, or just actually run a specified advocacy. And I'll take it over to Patrick now for the specified affirmatives.
Yeah, so for the specification affirmatives, there are a wide number of possibilities for this. Generally, because of the word substantially, the resolution is encouraging you to specify as much as you want, because you don't have to meet all you have to do is meet some certain threshold of what is substantial in order to access pretty much as many different possibilities as you want, and they're all theoretically justified. So the first way that people will likely specify is through country specification. So that would be reading a plan that's like the United States ought to eliminate its military involvement in country or a group of countries. So as is typical, specifying countries is going to be the simplest and most theoretically justified way to reduce the size of an AF. The common countries are going to be Syria, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine, Kuwait, and Bahrain. All of these have significant United States military involvement in them right now. And it's very easy to make the argument that any one of those countries, by eliminating your military involvement in those countries, it would be a significant reduction in the United States' military involvement in the region as a whole. So generally, an entire country, as long as you can justify that those as long as you can justify that those involvements currently are a significant portion, you will have no issue justifying that you're significant, substantial, or yeah. The second is going to be type of military involvement. So the United States ought to reduce its military involvement in a given country by eliminating some certain activity. So this is generally most likely going to be with specifying a country, but again, it doesn't have to be. You can treat the act or you can specify the act which reduces military involvement. So that could include arms sales, that can include financial aid, that could include specifying a number of to be removed from the region as a whole, or it could be specifying a base in the certain number of bases. All of these things are possible specification areas. I think the best one is going to be either just specify a country in general or specify arms sales or arms aid to a country, just because those are going to be the most, like the largest areas of military involvement in these regions. But again, as long as you can find a definition that justifies that you're being significant and that you're reaching that threshold of substantial, you're not going to have a problem with topicality because specification is justified and is incentivized on the topic. Next up, I'm going to hand it over briefly to Brock for framing.
Okay, so there are a lot of ways to frame this, besides just like the default like util LARP strategy. You also have the much beloved just soft left affirmative, where you're using minimizing structural violence to frame the round. This will probably be used with contentions that also just focus on the harms of U.S. hegemony or the particular harms of U.S. involvement to the West Asian or North Africa region. So it probably won't look too different from those HORAS apps I mentioned earlier in terms of the links and the impacts. They're going to be very similar. Next is prioritizing international law or securing international law, however you want to word it. The idea is that U.S. military presence in the West Asian North Africa region violates some aspect of international law based on neutrality, exploitation, or any other form of involvement. The hardest part about this is just tracking down like what specifically the United States is violating here. But as usual with international law apps, it's going to be a like pretty clear cut as to whether or not the contention level links, or it should be. The ideal app would find something very clear that the U.S. is violating, and then all the debate would occur on the framing level. But essentially, it would say that doing the app is therefore necessary to comply with international law because you're removing U.S. military presence, you're bringing U.S. back in line. I would say that apps running this should specify for their advocacy that they're going to completely eliminate U.S. military presence, because if it's something like where it's either you're violating international law or you're not, specifying like, oh, well, we'll reduce this many troops probably isn't the best idea. It can also link to some government rights critiques, so just be careful about that when running this, but it's always an option. Next is respecting sovereignty. I think this, or at least some variation of it, along with Kant, which I'll talk about later, are going to be really popular for framing on this topic. The idea is that U.S. military presence in the West Asian North Africa region somehow violates the sovereignty of legitimate states because it's allowing a superpower to come in and essentially determine their legitimacy. It's allowing them to interfere in their affairs, and that's inherently violating their sovereignty and therefore like harming their ability to operate as a legitimate state. This also probably has some literature and impact overlap with international law and structural violence. So if you're researching various affirmatives, you could maybe hit 3 at once by sort of researching this general idea of the U.S. military and its presence violating sovereignty. It can also link to many set call critiques depending on what the advantage areas the app goes for. So again, that's something to keep in mind. But in general, I think the link on this is pretty strong. And again, similar is Kant. I think the Kant app would actually be pretty strong on this topic. Again, for the similar reasons of U.S. military presence violates sovereignty. It's not something that can be universally willed. It treats people as a means to an end and is therefore exploitative. So there's likely a lot of overlap with that sovereignty evidence as well. Plus, with Kant, there's also a lot of good literature that talk about international relations and human rights law, and it applies Kantian concepts to these. So I think it would be pretty fruitful, especially if you're already someone who likes to debate Kant, to try to do some digging there. I'll take it over to Patrick for critiques.
Yeah, so with the critique, most of the generic K ground is going to be on the AF side because the AF is moving away from the oppressive status quo. However, of course, because the AF is acting within the state, there's some questions on whether or not this is firmly affirmative ground, or if there's some sort of questions that can be had by the negative on whether these critiques are actually able to solve. But the critique ground is pretty strong on the affirmative because the AF is moving away from that oppression. First up is going to be the security K. The security K links very, very well on this topic because the U.S. military presence is going to be representing that hypersecuritization and obsession with the security of the U.S. Because the U.S. is like pushing for U.S. hegemony, the security of energy resources, and the security of economic resources in the WANA region. There's so much literature on how the how the United States is pushing for security by like continuing their presence in this region, um, especially because the military is the most direct enforcer of U.S. security interests. So reducing its influence will de-escalate the situation from one of security. Specifically, right now there was a one of the United States energy security advisors who met in Israel to talk about offshore gas reserves in Gaza. So that would be one specific instance where the United States is pushing for security of resources abroad through the military and is exercising its military presence in order to push for those resources and gain access to them. Next up is going to be biopolitics or necropolitics, this sort of Foucauldian and Agamben level analysis, basically arguing that involvement in war and involvement in the military creates a politics of death by allowing politicians and military personnel to decide which lives are acceptable collateral damage. This is specifically pretty good with if you read on necropolitics specifically, talking about how creating a system of military engagement where American lives are incredibly like generally very safe in comparison to civilian lives that are often seen as quote collateral damage in a conflict, that allows you to make a very convincing argument that the United States should not be involving itself in these regions. So look at Foucault, Agamben, the Membe book. All of those are going to be ideas for how you can get behind this theory of power. And then there's also linked a couple resources on how Israel and how America in general in these regions are using war on terror rhetoric in order to justify biopolitics and necropolitics in the region. Next up will be settler colonialism. So setcol is probably going to be massive on this topic. It's, I think, generally one of the top three critiques at this point. In terms of how much people read it. So there's enough literature to where people will read it on any topic. US presence in WANA is a colonial mission under this theory of power because one, because the US state is not legitimate in the first place, but also because the US state is pushing for its interests in other countries where it's not headquartered, trying to subjugate other countries and other peoples through military might. There's a ton of specific literature on this topic. So if you're one of the setcol people, you will have no issues finding an affirmative and finding a negative as well. And then less directly, the US is supporting settler states like Israel through arms sales. That's something that, especially now after October 7th, has been incredibly highlighted with how a majority of Israel's weaponry is US made, US bought, and US owned, or well, previously US owned. Biden's missions are, or Biden's doctrine regarding the Gaza conflict is generally to sign a blank check to Israel. So we are incentivizing them to continue their settler colonialism of Palestine and of Gaza through this. So you could argue that eliminating arms sales to Israel is a very direct way to reduce settler colonialism and all of that. Next is going to be K's of capitalism. The U.S. military presence maintains capitalist interests. This is pretty clear after the War on Terror and after Iraq. It's very widely understood that the U.S. military's main goal in the War on Terror was to secure its economic and security interests abroad by using security rhetoric. So the U.S. is generally using military to contain countries it seems as threatening to capitalist dominance over the world economy. So think China, think Russia. It uses its military influence in order to sort of push them back back and maintain its capitalist control. And then the US also uses the military to control foreign economic resources like oil. So think back to that US energy security advisor who was meeting with Israel just on the 21st of November. So again, these are similar arguments to the security critique, but instead of talking about how security itself is bad, we're talking about how security interests and the United States' capitalist interests are enforcing a system that allows us to access these that allows us to reinforce and control capitalism abroad. And then Baudrillard, of course, this is not really specific to the affirmative or the negative, but it works on both. US involvement in a region is making it relevant to the West, which allows and incentivizes the media to report on things, creating symbolic representations of violence. And you could talk about how, based on his, the Gulf War did not take place, essays. There's quite a bit of literature on how that applies to Israel and Palestine, and how that also generally applies to modern American foreign policy in the region. So don't be afraid of taking either an affirmative or a negative stance on military engagement in the region, just generally because it's incentivizing the West to become involved with this region and its conflicts with violence that is to the audience constructed. And then next we'll push on to the negatives, and I'm going to hand it over to Brock for the disadvantages.
Yeah, so despite all the specification on this topic, you can still always have the generic disads. I guess the staple of any topic where the US is an actor or involved in any way is the politics disad. Basically, backlash as a consequence of uncalculated change in politics. The idea is going to be that US reducing military presence is going to cause some kind of backlash. Maybe it's electoral, maybe it's a loss of political capital, but either way, it's usually something bad that happens to Democrats. So either they lose, in this case, the 2024 elections, or some important bill that's on the table right now doesn't get passed. So research is really important here. You have to prove the AF is unpopular to Republicans right now. Research is incredibly important for this. Another thing that complicates this is like there are some aspects of less presence in the Middle East that the Republican Party, I can't speak today, the Republican Party supports, but then there are some that aren't. So what the AF is specifically doing still might matter here, which is kind of weird for a politics disad. So just make sure your cards are as nuanced as possible and that you're truly cutting a good quality politics DA. I would say this is one of the topics where you don't just want to like recycle the same politics DA you read on the fossil fuel extraction topic with just like one different link card. I would definitely like maybe just try to go through, change that up a little bit, improve the quality of evidence, and make sure it's all specific to the actual issue of military presence. That way, you're still having a strong generic disad. Next,
this is especially
the U.S. hegemony disad. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say that that's especially important because this is a foreign policy topic, and Republican and Democrats generally align a lot more on foreign policy than domestic policy. So while like progressives find military engagement to be problematic, neoliberal Democrats feel that it's generally fine. So you're probably going to have a harder time justifying politics disads if you don't do adequate research on specificity of the affirmatives.
Yeah, I think maybe focusing on the 2024 midterms, like for representatives and whatnot, I think that might be potentially strong just because that's where you'll see like that's where you can actually get impacts off of those progressive versus neoliberal fault lines changing, which is definitely something that really could happen if the affirmative took place. Okay, on a U.S. hegemony. Essentially, this is just the converse of whatever the app is saying about U.S. hegemony. So you'd be claiming that the U.S. hegemony is actually maintained via military presence in the Wana region and that this is a good thing. you said the AF decks U.S. hegemony, and that this leads to whatever impacts you want to talk about. I mean, you could talk about the pretty typical U.S. hedge good impacts. It's useful for strong economies, democratic influence, military strategy. But this also makes hegemony good and bad debates inevitable. So not only will you have some challenge on the link level, probably, but you'll also probably have some impact challenge there. The useful thing about this DA is that you know you have a pretty much guaranteed link if the app is running a US hedge bad affirmative, in which case it's really just an impact debate then. So calculate your chances there. If you're a debater who's really good at those impact calc debates, then go ahead. But it might get a little messy on the internal link impact level if you do. Okay, next is China hegemony disads, or you can do it with Russia as well. It's similar to the previous disad, except this one's focusing more on what country would replace the United States when it no longer becomes the global hegemon because the affirmative has happened. I think these are perhaps a little better than the US hedge good disads because you're not biting the bullet as much. It's just generally more persuasive, I found, to focus on why the hegemony of another country is bad than why U.S. hegemony is independently good, especially because the app is probably going to come out guns blazing with a litany of reasons as to why U.S. hegemony is independently bad. So I think focusing maybe on the potential harms of China or Russia would be useful here. You would have to do a lot of research with this, though, to see how they're already sort of trying to get involved in this region because it might be a little iffy there, especially if like you're unable to prove that they would even gain anything by the United States no longer being in the region. I think there's maybe an argument to be made that China especially doesn't want to be involved in that region and that China wouldn't really gain anything from the US pulling out. So just something to think about there. There's also always, if the app isn't running US hedge bad, you can always, like, there's always going to be impact turns that you have to watch out for here. So, and other turns like that. And then, of course, there's going to be country-specific disads or disads that are just specific to whatever the affirmative advocacy is. It's going to be really hard to have an infinite amount of these disads for every single affirmative advocacy, but I think you'll start to see which ones are going to be the most common on the AF, specifically arms sales, as Patrick talked about. So I think prepping a few of those DAs that are ready to link into the specific advocacy of the affirmative would be useful. Again, obviously, you're not going to be able to get them all. I'll pass it over to Patrick for counterplans.
Yeah, so on this topic, the counterplan ground is going to be a little bit limited because a lot of the topical counterplan grounds that we typically see in these topics is going to be affirmative ground due to the incentivization of substantial and the incentivization of specification. With that being said, there are, I think, 3 categories of counterplans that I think are going to be pretty universally acceptable, and you won't run into many challenges with them. So the first one is going to be plan-inclusive counterplans. Whole resolution affirmatives are going to be uniquely susceptible to these because any affirmative plan can be read as a pick when the AF fails to specify. And this is significantly more theoretically justified than normal, as the word significantly substantially, sorry, that's written wrong. The word substantially signifies signals to affirmatives that specification is recommended in the first place, so negatives don't garner offense off of things that the AF also defends, which means that ultimately, if the affirmative is not specifying, then picks are fair game. It's also important to recognize that Neeblety is not, well, I'll talk about that, never mind. The second type of counterplan is going to be regulation counterplans. So a common counterplan is going to be likely to change or regulate something about the nature of the US military presence in the WANA region. So that could include changing the makeup of station forces, implementing greater restrictions on their actions, any of those sorts of things. It could also include controls that specify when the US is allowed to perform direct foreign arms sales or participate in military action. And that's going to likely improve counterplans against the affirmatives. And then these will also work against, or these are also going to be pretty helpful against like specified AFs, because you can just have evidence as to why reducing act, like you can basically just steal the offense of the affirmative by saying that yes, in the current situation in Gaza, the United States doing arms sales is bad, but there are other situations where we're providing arms to countries like Israel might be a good thing, and completely ceasing our military engagement with them by reducing our arms sales is probably not a great thing, because it's preventing them from having access to resources that they might need in the event that they were actually targeted by foreign nations. This is also applicable to other countries like Saudi Arabia, where you could put conditions on them receiving arms sales. So mainly like, we'll stop arms sales if you stop using them to commit atrocities in Yemen. So these are various ways that you can do the affirmative, but put a condition on it and steal that offense while not being too theoretically questionable. And then the next one is going to be consult counterplans. So because the US is not located within a region, we don't generally have the best knowledge of the complex geopolitical situation in WANA. So the NEG can consult foreign powers in the region like Saudi Arabia, Palestine, and Iran, and then do what they say. Those counterplans are going to be different depending on the affirmative, so you'll have to make sure that you're able and willing to change the counterplan text and have specific information on various regions, why those various countries are important to consult. Or you can consult foreign entities like NATO, the UN, as those have more neutral knowledge and interests than those who are directly involved, like the US. Specifically, you want to with consult counterplans, you want to find reasons why these countries are willing to get or willing to make, why they're engaged in the region in the first place. Why do they have a stance? You want to figure out generally what choice they're going, or what they're going to say, right? And then garner offense off of a world where they we're a world where you agree to binding consultation with those countries. One way that you can do really cheaty consultation counterplans is you say that it's not binding consultation, and you basically just do the AF, but consult this country first. And no matter what they say, you're just going to do the AF anyway. Generally, those are just there to steal offense from the affirmative. They're a little bit theoretically questionable, but they exist. But if you don't want to be theoretically questionable, make sure that you mention in your counterplan text that you're entering prior and binding consultation with these regions, and ensure that you actually follow the consultation. So that means that if your opponent has evidence saying that when consulted, these countries will say the opposite of what the affirmative or the opposite of what the negative says will happen, then you have to go with that. You have to agree that you have to either dispute their evidence, or just agree or like take the counter plan. And then next up on critiques, most of this is going to be, again, on the affirmative, but if you can find the necessary links, anything is obviously going to still work for the negative. So first is going to be Ks of representation. So reps Ks, where the link is the wording of the affirmative, are going to be very, very easy on this topic. I already cut one that I put in the topic or in the topic analysis doc that will be distributed after the meeting. So everybody should prep a few of these for no other reason than time skew, if anything, because like most of the time it's just one card, and then like you say, it's an IVI. Security reps Ks are going to be uniquely applicable because many affirmatives are just likely to use cards that contain outdated or problematic terms for the WANA region, or other words that create a westernized or securitized view of the region. So like specifically the phrase Middle East is problematic because it is uniquely Eurocentric, because the middle of the East is referent to the West. Um, it's used as a term in economic and security policy, and it's kind of a new term itself, only originating in the late 1920s ish. Um, so it's directly linked to securitization of the region. So um, cards that use highlighted cards that use the term Middle East would link to a security reps K, and there are plenty of other examples of how you can read reps Ks on this topic just based on the language of the affirmative. The next type of critique is going to be settler colonialism. So while the AF might make moves against an oppressive system, like I said earlier, very few affirmatives are going to include a complete rejection of military involvement overall, because that's just not like a strategic decision to say, yeah, the military sucks entirely. Um, so while the AF might make moves against that oppressive system, it's not eliminating that oppressive system. And they're failing to reject a system of colonialism overall, which serves to justify it by acting within that system. And also generally set call links are probably likely to refer to the fact that one topical affirmative is to completely remove the military from water, but nobody is going to debate that. Because that's a massive AF burden. It's not strategic to say screw the military every instance always. So every AF is going to link to the security K for not being radical enough. And next is postmodernism. So Baudrillard, Deleuze, or other postmodern critiques are still going to link because they always are options. Generally, there's never going to be a topic where Deleuze and Baudrillard don't link. You just have to understand the theory, which that's the real hard part. I think Baudrillard Ks are generally very similar between the affirmative and the negative, because you're believing in a world where violence is constructed by media and enforced by separation from that world. And that creates symbols which can be used to control people and produce capitalism in the semio-capital theory of whatever Baudrillard believes in. And then next, I will hand it over to Brock for framing.
Okay, so framing on the negative for this topic is the variations in framing perhaps aren't the most strategic, and that's because most of the link changes and impacts are going to essentially be the same under all framings. They'll just be slightly tweaked. The impacts will be specifically, so you're not getting as much of that advantage of having like being able to have really specific or weird contentions because of your framing. Obviously, first utilitarianism is going to be the most common, especially with hedge. Most debates on this topic we're going to be using utilitarian impact calc as usual. But I think especially just with the foreign policy topic, there's going to be a lot of ability to like race to extinction as normal and things like that. But there is some variation. So, for example, social contract theory, you could argue that the United States government is obliged to provide security for its citizens, and therefore doing the AF sort of violates that obligation by the United States no longer using its military presence to sort of enforce the security of U.S. hegemony. The thing is, it does link very directly into security. So I think you should be very careful about which AFs you use this social contract theory argument against, but it could be a way to deviate from the simple, purely consequentialist analysis of this topic and look a little bit more at government's obligations. Next, international law. Sort of the same idea as on the affirmative, except you're just saying U.S. presence in the Rwanda region is necessary to maintain international law, including human rights law. I doubt you're going to find anything that says the United States is actually compelled to be there according to law, which means this is maybe a little less strong of an argument than it is on the AF because you're not actually directly inherently having that link. You're having to prove that the United States presence actually accomplishes what it's trying to accomplish, which it is good to try to sort of straddle that line and try to access things like human rights and try to like highlight the good parts of U.S. hegemony and U.S. presence, but also try to avoid like impacts like war and still get access to the fact that the AF may increase instability or increase the risk of war, but that way you're not committing too hard to either one. Again, with all of these, as you can see, a lot of the link chains are still predicated on the fact that U.S. presence actually accomplishes something good consequentially, which means that again, it's not going to be the most strategic to be creative with the framing. I will say that Kant's really seasoned Kant debaters are probably going to find some way to weave him in on the negative. I think the link is way stronger in the app here, but everyone always finds some way. So that's always an option. I'll hand it over to Patrick for the topicality.
Yeah. So topicality is going to be big on this topic. There's no way around it. Generally, the main words that you're going to see defined for topicality are going to be T substantial. So it's going to be useful against apps that overspecify. That's kind of the best way to get that niche that you would normally get from Nebel T. T substantial is going to be useful for apps that overspecify because there's tons of different definitions for substantial, just like look into the old OpenEv docs. Like you can find definitions of substantial that range anywhere from 1% to 99% is substantial. So there's tons of different definitions for substantial. You should be prepping multiple interpretations, and it's going to be strategic to read this in literally most rounds to pin the AF to some stasis point so they don't shift later in the 2AC, or sorry, the 2AR, or the 1AR. Making sure that the affirmative is pinned to some sort of stasis point for substantiality is going to be important. What's important that I accidentally skipped over is that Nebel T is not applicable to this topic because it doesn't use bare plurals like countries, and it also doesn't suggest a prioritization of values, which means that specification is absolutely justified. There's no way around it. Like if you want to have the specification bad debate, the best way you're going to be able to do that is with T substantial and by targeting the ways in which people are actually affirming the resolution rather than reading some generic topicality argument that's been passed down since the lethal autonomous weapons topic, or even earlier. I don't know, whenever Nebel T started. So like we can finally be free of the boring picks debates, but Nebel T is something that you're not going to be able to read. You need to be focusing on more specific and more well-prepped topicality evidence that you don't generally see in LD. So again, that's why this topic is so similar to a policy topic, because it uses the word substantial. Another word that I don't think I put in the slideshow, but that's also going to be important is WANA in general. People are going to read definitions of West Asia and North Africa that absolutely are not within this region, or that maybe you just want to get a time skew on them so you can read a really narrow definition of the countries that are included within WANA. And so just having multiple lists of WANA countries is going to be beneficial because you can use T-WANA to sort of ensure that you're able to maintain a stasis point for what we're actually talking about, but also maintain a firm grasp over the debate. So make sure that people aren't over specifying, make sure people aren't squirreling away, and make sure that you're able to actually debate the topic in some meaningful way. And then on theory, spec shells are going to be the most common thing that you'll see. Like it or not, the affirmative has so many roots that if they don't specify, the neg is going to read spec shells. So some ones that I think are going to be common are going to be must spec country, must spec type of military presence, but other shells are also going to be common. I just can't think of any like before I see them. I'm not like a theory wizard. And I also haven't seen the AFs that people are going to be reading. So prep for other spec shells, have justifications for everything that you're specifying, but also have justifications for the things that you're not specifying. Yeah, another one that I think might be common is requesting definitions. So must spec what significant is a possibility, but again, the abuse story might be hard to pin down because somebody not specifying a definition is something that you can figure out during cross-examination rather than during the 1AC. That sort of sets up a burden that might be hard to confirm. But again, in the easier rounds, that might be like a way to a free ballot. So that's the sort of things that you want to think about on generic theory arguments. Obviously, most of the theory arguments that people read are going to not be related to the topic at all. So, like, theory debaters can do whatever they want normally, and they'll still have access to those things. So now, just generally on to questions. Brock and I are going to open the floor for, I think, about 10 minutes is how long we made it last time. So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or unmute and ask, and we will answer those as best we can.
Quickly before the first question, I just want to add on the very last, like about the last slide, the previous one, a potential circular issue with the word substantial, specifically that there's going to be people who claim that, well, we sort of have specified substantial because as long as we're solving for impacts, then that's a substantial change. And I think that could be a potential justification of someone not specing substantial, but that does lead to this sort of circular reasoning argument where you're saying you have solvency because you're doing the resolution, and that obviously the affirmative is claiming that solves something, but then you're also saying that we'll know what the bright line for substantial is because we'll know, like, something is substantial as long as it's causing an impact or it's causing a significant change to happen. I could see that occurring just as that a similar situation played out on the China prioritizing environmental protection or economic growth topic. So just be prepared for that.
All right, yeah. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Um,
There's one in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the easy way or the easy negs for brand new LGers to digest are going to be hedge, just because hedge is something that there's so much research on that it's just very easy to understand. It's also something that most debaters have some preconceived notions on, because they've been inundated with rhetoric about how U.S. hedge has impacts. Most debaters grew up in the era of the war on terror. So making arguments about US hedge being good or bad and how the Western or the West Asia, North Africa region is contributing to US hedge, those are going to be very easy arguments to digest for pretty much anyone.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I would say that negs that focus on the potential positives on the region of the United States being involved there. So things like bolstering democracy, protecting human rights, economic development, things like that. That's going to be another thing where there's going to be a lot of easily accessible literature out there. And again, that's another narrative that has been sort of like communicated very often during the war on terror. So for any young debater or a new LDer, that's going to be something that they'll understand intuitively.
So somebody asked how to rebut theory. I think that's a little bit complicated to just quickly explain in the topic lecture. But I think the easiest way to rebut specifically the specification theory is just going to like push for reasonability on those arguments that Brock was talking about. So like basically the argument would be that you don't have to specify something if it's clear that your impacts can outweigh. Because if you can argue that your impacts will outweigh whatever the neg impacts are, and you have solvency to those impacts, then it's pretty clear that you're doing something significant if it creates significant impacts. However, this argument could be susceptible to some sort of effects T argumentation because you're only significant insofar as you're creating a significant outcome. But I think that that's going to be a little bit of a complex argument for LDers to make, especially with the short speech times. That's something that generally only happens in policy. Um, but if you're interested in talking about how to rebut theory, we can put together some resources for theory. There's also a ton of resources out there on how to rebut theory. It's just kind of a little bit too complex for this specific lecture. Somebody asked, would the easy offs be the same running neg once more? I think the easy offs for neg are going to be generally hedge good or bad, or generally hedge good, or and probably some sort of regulation counterplan are going to be the easiest off case arguments for the neg to run. Let's see. Yes, a copy of the PowerPoint will be sent out on the Discord after this, as well as on Equality and Forensics' YouTube page once this gets updated or uploaded to the YouTube. I'm not familiar with AFRICOM BAD. Brock, do you have any idea what that is?
It's the United States Africa Command. I'm not familiar with that, but I would assume, just based on general knowledge, that is talking specifically about how the United States presence in Africa and the conduct of the United States Africa Command has been bad in some way or is destabilizing in some way. So to me, it sounds like that argument is focusing more on the West Africa, or not West Africa, the North Africa part of the WANA region. So I would say that that argument for the neg is maybe focusing on the impacts that the affirmative would have to that specific region if military presence was removed in wherever the United States Africa Command has jurisdiction over. But yeah, I would have to look more into it to conclusively say that.
And then somebody asked for trade-off arguments if it would be easier to prove that money being redirected if the argument is prioritizing other military priorities. So like shifting priorities to East Asia or Ukraine. I think Brock said that they think that that would be easier to prove, but you need to still do the research and look into what the lit is asking, because any sort of shifting resources argument is always going to be contingent upon how you're expecting those resources to shift and making sure that those resources are able to shift. Let's see. There can be a kind of whole res deterrence argument be made on the neg. So a deterrence DA against a whole res AF. I think that there's a lot of argumentation on deterrence, whether it's good or bad. If the affirmative is arguing that, yeah, I think deterrence DAs could work, but I think that the deterrence debate has already played out quite a lot in the past. So I don't know how well, like especially for like new debaters, that'll be easy. I don't know how much new evidence there is because I haven't seen deterrence arguments made in quite a while since like the nukes topic in 2019 or 2020. But yeah, I think that deterrence could work if you had enough evidence that what America was doing right now was actually creating deterrence of foreign military powers. And I think that's a little bit difficult, especially because right now is a uniquely conflict-prone time in the Middle Eastern or in the WANA regions geopolitics, where we have generally one very major conflict going on right now, as well as another quite a few other conflicts that are have the potential to go on. So the uniqueness is very strong on deterrence. Um, yeah, let's see. Is there going to have to be a ton of prep for Israel Hamas? I would say, yeah, just because it's very solidly within the region, and like an affirmative can just specify stop giving weapons to Israel, and now the debate is about Israel Hamas conflicts. So yeah, you will have to do prep on that region.
I would say on the next question of whether or not that's going to be more of a neg or half argument, I would say it's going to be most common on the affirmative, focusing on how removing U.S. military presence would be good and help alleviate that conflict. Um, I mean, but I could see that on the negative as well. On the negative, it could take, I suppose, it could take a pro or anti-Israel stance there, but it would really depend on like what you are saying U.S. military presence is doing and how that's affecting that conflict, and what you're saying that removal is. Obviously, you're saying that the removal from the app is going to somehow affect that conflict negatively. So I would say it's all about how you're focusing on one, what actually negatively affecting that conflict looks like, what your position on that is, and two, making sure you're having good evidence that explains what the affirmative, what the effects that that's going to have on the conflict. So, in short, it's complicated and it depends.
Um, is there link or is there lit for westernization bad? Um, yeah, I would say that that would probably be an affirmative argument, just generally on the affirmatives using their military power and military hegemony to enforce Western ideals within these countries. Um, and then you could argue that that that's bad because it's like reducing the cultural hegemony of these like the people who currently live there. And what would be the internal link to populism as an affirmative advantage and a negative disad? I think it's pretty clear that right now, like specifically, um, right-wing news outlets are rallying behind the Israel or behind Israel in general within within the status quo. So, like taking away the affirmatives or taking away America's support of Israel would rally populists because right now populists are rallying behind Israel, and they're arguing that, yeah, like so specifically like right-wing populism is on the rise because of the Israel's campaign in Gaza. And so for an egg disad, you could argue that the affirmative taking away Israel's or taking away America's support of Israel would support pop or would like incentivize populists to get their way because they want more support of Israel. And then as an affirmative advantage, I don't really know what you would go for there. Brock, do you have any ideas?
Mm, I'm not. I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose you could argue that like the longer we wait to not do the app, or the longer we don't do it, there's going to be more and more um, antagonism, especially on the populist right, over our presence in the Wana region. And then I guess the argument would be that doing the affirmative would sort of help cool that down by sort of like, I guess, in a way, giving the populace right what they want, but would sort of cool down that inflammation by showing that the United States can sort of reorient to focus more on American interests and less on these interventionist excursions abroad. I think that that's going to be a little harder to prove, especially given that you're sort of biting the bullet then on, well, you're just giving the populists what they want. Um, but if you can find some good literature, I suppose I could see some like good, like nuanced, complex political science literature that explains that that would help defuse the movement towards populism in the United States.
I think we're reaching the end at this point. So I wanted to briefly just go through all of the resources that EIF has. Everybody's aware of them now that we're at the end. We have a Discord, so in the chat, I just posted an invite link to the Discord, so please join if you have not already. There's an active community where you can get useful advice on the affirmatives or on whatever you want to ask for improving at debate. On the website at equalityinforensics.org. There's free resources, there's coaching, and there's a weekly blog where we talk about debate and how that affects lower income or small schoolers in debate. And then there's also the Instagram, which is at Equality in Forensics, where we have useful updates on EIF and their opportunities. We have other opportunities through Instagram, which are advertised, and we have, again, we advertise the weekly blog through that. Another like useful resource that we've had through EIF has been allowing independents to go to tournaments like the TOC Digital Series while reducing their administration fees by participating through EIF. So if that's something that would be interesting to you or that would help you, that's something that you can go for. With that, I think that's it. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to join the Discord and ask away there. But we're reaching the end of the time slot. So yeah, have a good night. Thank you for showing up. And yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, good night, everyone.